Hello and welcome to Maiden, Matriarch with me, Louise Perry. My guest today is Ashley Colby. She's an environmental scientist and the co-founder of the Rizoma Field School. We spoke about the fact that our modern way of life is completely environmentally unsustainable, and Ashley's related decision to uproot her family from America and move to a homestead in Uruguay, and why domestic roles in the homesteading life are completely different from those in the modern West when it comes to the gender division of labour. In the extended version of the episode, we also spoke about Ashley's educational philosophy and how we can all apply some of the insights gleaned from homesteading to the rest of our lives. As usual, you can find an extended version of this episode, plus bonus episodes and the Maiden Mother Matriarch chat community at my Substack, louiseperry.substack.com. Enjoy. So Ashley, let's start by talking about the link that you see between environmentalism and women's rights.
Sure. So a little bit about my background. I am a sociologist by training. I have my PhD in sociology, and I focused on environmental sociology for my PhD studies. And in the process of getting my PhD, I did a deep dive on, for my dissertation work, on people who self-produce food, and kind of just ended up coming to this larger scale, almost Marxist, historical understanding of the process by which humans lived in most of civilization, and how different it is now in the industrial era. And so, long story short, my dissertation work sort of focused on this re-embracing of what is, I think, our most common way of interacting with nature in most of human civilization, which is to have some amount of self-production, some amount of connection to the land through activities in the home, home economics and small scale food production and other kind of craft economies. That ties in with this larger scale critique I have, that kind of the best language I've ever heard of this critique is basically Paul Kingsnorth, his concept of the machine. And basically the machine is in the broadest possible sense, the industrial technological civilization. I think a lot of people just don't really realize, because it's been a couple of generations for most of the developed world living in this advanced economy, that this is really the anomaly in most of human history. Most of human history wasn't lived this way. And so that machine critique kind of fits into my work all over the place. I'm interested in my academic research on food systems, but I think in my life I've taken that similar critique to women's issues, to family life, on a personal level. So I think about the ways in which the thrust of industrial technological civilization is in many ways about putting, every aspect of human life into the marketplace as possible, to make these Faustian bargains of advancing technological civilization at the expense of any of the above. And so so I think the connection is this idea of the ways in which the machine and advanced technology kind of have its tentacles in so many aspects of our life. In some ways, it's even hard to see. It's almost like the water we swim in. So it takes some unpacking to see the connections, but in the same way as Industrial agriculture, for example, is highly reliant upon technology, um, highly specialized. Less and less people, have like a decentralized control over, what in Marxist terms we call the means of production. The same thing is true with women's bodies, for example. Just sort of outsourcing everything that's possible to be outsourced to the profitable mechanism, ways in which we can commodify human bodies, women's bodies, and yeah, and a lot follows from that. But I think this is what sort of ties together my work in general. That my interest in women's issues is born out of being a mother, and kind of realizing the extent to which commodification and the profit motive has really sort of impacted some of the most sacred, I would say, but also the most empowering aspects of what it is to be a human, and have control over your own destiny, self-determination, self-reliance, and all of that.
That idea of the sacred is something I think about a lot, and whether or not it's really possible for people to continue having any conception of the sacred if there's nothing upstairs, if they don't believe in God, if it's not fitting into some theological or supernatural scheme, can we still think of things as sacred? I think people tend to feel that things are sacred. And would you say, I mean, bearing in mind that, of course, that Paul Kingsnorth is a Christian writer, so he's fitting the idea of the machine into that comprehensive worldview that Christianity offers. Do you see this idea of the machine as being fundamentally at odds with the idea of the sacred?
Yeah, I do. And so this is something I'm exploring on my podcast more and more in recent months, which is I'm coming to the conclusion. I guess let's step back a second and say, I would argue that in the industrial modern era, in the era of nation states, you either have the outsourcing of social norms to the marketplace or to the state. And it's a relatively new phenomenon to have expectations that social norms would be fully outsourced to these sort of inhumane institutions. So like the nation state is a relatively new social technology. And right now, the majority of the conversation is about leftists saying the nation state can handle the social norms we need to have a functioning society, and conservatives or more right-leaning people tend to think the market can handle those. And I would fundamentally, I think what's missing from those left and right discussions is the ways in which social norms work interpersonally, at the community level, at local, in between family members, community members. And I think that there is fundamentally missing from most political discussions is this this realization that, for example, the state just simply cannot enforce certain norms if they get completely out of control with anywhere as much power as culture can. So if you take that as an assumption, then it follows that whatever the culture is fundamentally does have to have a shared sense of what is sacred and what is profane to be able to make those judgments in between family members or community members. What I'm not convinced of is that there is a universal sacred and profane, but I am convinced that there needs to be some shared sense of what it is. And it could be, for example, like a overlapping, two overlapping Venn diagram type circles of what is sacred and what is profane, that are both Christian but look different in different communities or something like that. I'm really interested in localism as a big part of the question of how do we move forward. Localism meaning local norms, community norms, that differ place to place for reasons, for important reasons. And so, but at the same time, I've also really been embracing more and more my Christian upbringing, and the sense that my sense of the sacred and the profane, and my sense of what social norms, what is good, what is the good life, what is an appropriate way to act, are Judeo-Christian in nature, and I think it's okay to embrace that. I think one of the weird brainworms of modernity is this idea that it's like you must break with all traditions of the past because sometimes traditions came with some oppression and therefore we should throw the whole thing out. But I think you're missing so much when you throw out what is effectively iterative morality that moved through time because it worked. I mean, it sort of worked through generations and evolved in the way that it did because it was functional in different circumstances, in different cultures, in different material circumstances. So I think it would be it's the right move, and the current system is to sort of I think both look back to those traditional ways in which people made clear what was the sacred and what was the profane, but without, you don't have to bring the whole of every past tradition or past institution into your modern decision making about how to live a good life or how to be a moral person. I think it's important to let those continue to evolve, but not feel like the need to start from scratch. I had somebody on the podcast recently who was talking about, there's a lot of empty churches in the UK, and I think we should try to use those churches to, his name is Adam Greenfield. He came on with Dugald Hine. He said, I think we should try to bring these churches, we should try to use them as community centers, and we should go there and have different rituals around the seasons and around people's parts of their life. And Dugald Hine was saying, and what really works well is when there's like a founding mythology. I'm like, we're just describing a church. We're really just describing a church here. And it's funny because a lot of people just end up sort of reinventing traditions with different names. But I do think it's okay to just, a lot of people will, for example, be religious, but they'll look towards Buddhism or some sort of non-Western religion as a way of like exploring religiosity. And I think it's important to, and okay to look at your own heritage for, figuring out those social norms of what is the good life, and figuring out for you and for your own community what is the sacred and the profane. And I would also just briefly add that there is a way in which the sacred and profane can be worked out through the development of relationship. And by that I mean in a family, you can make a family culture around what is good, what is a good way to act, what is what is appropriate morally, and then you can build sort of morality through relationships. In that relationship is the sort of ways in which people act that is good and appropriate. How to be loyal, how to be thoughtful, how to be there for people when they really need you to be. I don't really think it needs to be a top-down sense of what is sacred and profane, but like a co-creative process by just sort of showing up and showing what works is a way in which I think we can sort of think about moving forward and developing the sacred and the profane.
I'm so interested in this this sort of third way that isn't the market and isn't the state, because I think so much of our politics comes back constantly to this dialectic between the market and the state, and what was presented by, say, Tony Blair and other politicians of this century was the so-called third way, which was just a melding of the two. Whereas a true third way, I was reminded when you were speaking about a conversation I had with a friend recently, who might be listening. Hi, if so, about help that mothers receive after they've had a baby, because she's having a baby soon. And we were talking about the fact that hiring a maternity nurse, I don't know if that's what everyone calls them, but basically a woman who comes to your house and does loads of care for you for pay, it's a paid service, is so invaluable. But it's also something that, in traditional societies you have done for you generally by your sisters, your cousins, your mother, other female kin, neighbours, etc., or sometimes servants if you can afford it. And I was saying, gosh, everyone should have this. And she said, a kind of automatic response was, oh, so are you saying the state should pay for maternity nurses to come to people's houses? And I said, no, people should just do it for each other. Like that third way is so unimaginable in our politics right now. The idea of, as you say, of localism, of interconnected at the sort of micro scale, is something that I think has only recently, and nowhere near enough, entered into political conversations.
Yeah, and I would say to that, just yesterday I had an article come out in Unheard, and I think that there is a whole tradition in the UK, in the United States, but I would say, specifically in the most developed economies in the world, that is neither what we think of as traditionally left, state-based solutions, or traditionally right, market-based solutions. That is a sort of plea for living cultures. And I think in that vein is somebody like Emerson and Thoreau, but also Wendell Berry and Ivan Illich, and I wrote about Christopher Lasch. And, basically the idea is there's a spiritual lack, and the spiritual lack in some ways has to do with outsourcing the most important and most the ways in which we can have the most agency in our lives to either the market or the state. And instead, the alternative way of looking at things, which is really kind of hard to describe because it's so diverse looking on purpose, is a culture where people are capable, where they show up for one another, where so much of what's been outsourced gets brought back into the conversation. I had Ellen Sakassis on the podcast, and he's a big Illich scholar, and he was told this story about how he knew of these graduate students and I think researchers who all worked in this lab together, and one of their colleagues passed away at work, and everybody was unsurprisingly shocked by this, and one of the colleagues said, I think we should talk to each other. Let's sit and talk about this. Let's have a discussion. And another one said, no, we should probably bring in a bereavement counselor. We don't know what we're doing. And I think there is so many examples like this where people think like, I'm not capable. And this ties in with homesteading and homeschooling and showing up for your neighbors, localism. When my sister had a baby, I organized all her friends and said, like, let's all make a meal. Let's bring it by. Each of you will get a day. It'll be a nice way in which she won't have to have everybody coming at once to meet the baby, but little by little, people can drop it off. Don't stay too long, 15, 30 minutes. Meet the baby, give her something to eat that's good, that can have leftovers. These little ways in which we can pick up tiny bits of slack for one another, and how distributed across relationships, it really makes both the state and the market much more obsolete. And I think part of the reason that this third way hasn't really taken off is partially because there's really no power brokers that have an interest in advancing something like this. It really is kind of like a populist, in some ways, point of view, which is that the power is in people for one another. And um, in my unheard piece, I was saying, something along the lines of like homesteading and localism is just this way in which people can dip their toe in finding a connection to nature and to address some sense of a spiritual malaise, the lack of meaning in most people's work. Um, and some of the comments were like, this is utopian in nature. And I'm so frustrated by that because a utopian vision has some sort of lack of practical reality, when in reality, what you need to do to be, a good homesteader is just to get started. And it doesn't matter how small it is to get started. It's literally just taking a step toward some practical creation, production, as opposed to just finding meaning in either voting the right way or consuming the right way. But instead to be sort of the master of your destiny, even in the tiniest way, like having chickens. Is a step in this. It's the most practical step in the direction of self-determination. And I think a lot of people have been tricked into thinking, unless it's globally scalable in the sense of a perfect solution for everyone on the planet and can be implemented top down, it shouldn't be even considered. And I would say it's completely the opposite this third way. It's unless it makes sense in your particular life, then you should do it for you and your own life, and find ways that make sense that are particular to your place. But fundamentally, that is what like human culture is. It's this ways in which we find agency and capacity and the ability to produce for ourselves. It's what we've always done, really, as humans, is finding ways to interact with nature and each other to make culture and to take care of ourselves.
Um, so bear in mind that you're speaking to a woman who has never managed to own a coriander plant without killing it. So I'm by no means an expert in domestic agriculture, but I am very interested in this idea of being sort of food self-sufficient. And I think a lot of the time when people think about survivalism, let's say, so this idea of being self-sufficient, people will think of guys in camo who have a thing about guns. Whereas, of course, actually, there's a lot of space between only having enough food in your fridge to last you 24 hours and having enough food in your bunker to last you several years. And I was speaking recently to a family friend who lives in Bermuda, which is a very hurricane prone area. And I was talking about survivalism because I was writing a column about it at the time. And her response was like, oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. They have multiple forms of power generator. They have a bunch of canned food and drinking water and all this kind of stuff, just as standard, because they live in a part of the world that's prone to natural disasters. Whereas in the UK, where I live, we basically don't have natural disasters, so it's not something that people think about. But I'm interested in how you view this idea of people prepping without being preppers, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yes. So, a little bit of background. I grew up in Chicago. This in the city, South Side. My father's a firefighter. It's true urban existence. So this is none of this is in my history or anything, which I think is important because it really isn't, again, something that is in the realm of experts. So I think part of it is that I got somewhat memed by studying sociology, environmental sociology, and realizing just how much of a precipice we're on in terms of potential social unrest, potentially cascading environmental problems, the interdependence required for global supply chains is worrying. So I think most environmental sociologists are pretty firmly in the doomer camp in terms of business as usual being able to continue forever. And it might be a few decades from now where there's actual disruptions that I'll be happy that I have these provisions all set up. But I personally have the mission to sort of learn some of these skills and help others along who are interested, and make it accessible, make it normal. Again, I want to clarify that for most of human history, for most of the world, and still in most of the world, people have some sort of small scale self-sufficiency projects going on. People have chickens, lots of people have gardens and fruit trees, a lot of people make things at home regularly. So it's really only in the last generation or two in the most advanced economies in the world where this is not a normal thing. So we're the anomaly. And I would also say there's one of the inspirations I've had for my work is a writer named John Michael Greer, who sort of talks about energy realism, sort of this idea that, oil is a very cheap resource. It takes a lot of oil to make alternative energies, and therefore, we just can't expect business as usual to continue on. And he has a famous phrase, which is collapse now and avoid the rush, meaning if you were prepared ahead of time, then it doesn't become this like scramble in a situation. You have some skills, you know how to handle yourself. And so my husband and I, in 2012, bought land in Uruguay in South America. We moved here in 2016. We have 3 little girls, and basically we're just in the process of building out skills, from being city folks to being able to do things with our hands. In some ways is like a practice in spirituality. And then just to build out redundancies so that if any one system failed, you'd have some alternatives. So we have a generator, we have a solar water heater to heat our water and an electric water heater too. So we've got multiple ways of heating water. We have a wood stove and also a heat pump, heaters in the house. So just these different systems. We have big orchards. I would love to develop an olive vineyard. I would love to make olive oil eventually. I'd love to make a vineyard and make wine eventually. We have some chickens now. We've had cattle in the past. We are trying to do something called regenerative agriculture, which we can get into what that means and how it works and what the thesis behind it is. And the idea is just to be stewards of the land, to teach our kids where food comes from in just simple little ways. Having the chickens run around and the dogs and the cat. It's fun. It's lovely. And it doesn't have to be extreme. It doesn't have to be like this Instagram cottagecore fantasy to like even to have anyone in a suburb could have a little, container garden of potatoes there's just a huge amount of efficacy that comes from that. This sense of the ability of to do things with your own hands, to show your kids how it's possible to do that, to have them, as they grow older, take some responsibility for some of these chores. I think it's just missing from a lot of people's lives. It's sort of a sense that you're able to do things. And then another thing we've been working on, when we bought the property, we have a old brick building that was, I think, built in the 1920s, and had bats and multiple different creatures living in it when we got here. And, slowly cleaning it out and renovating it. We're getting very close to being able to use the space. We think we'll use it as like a sort of hangout space for our daughters and maybe a music room. So, these kind of things where we didn't have any skills in masonry, and my husband, ripped the roof off and replaced it. Just sort of seeing the work of your own hands. It's it's satisfying in a spiritually important way, I think.
Maiden Mother Matriarch is brought to you by Keeper, the world's most advanced matchmaking solution. Now, many of you will know that I'm normally extremely suspicious of dating apps like Tinder and Bumble, which tend to produce repeat customers who must endure endless, miserable hookups and short-term relationships without ever finding a spouse. Well, Keeper is a completely different kind of service. Its algorithm prioritizes immediate attraction, but also, crucially, long-term compatibility, because forever is the goal. Everyone in the Keeper matchmaking pool is there because they want to find a spouse. Using psychometric tests like Big Five, IQ, and masculine feminine polarity, Keeper can accurately predict who you're going to have the strongest chemistry with. The platform only gives you a match if you are an exact fit psychometrically and if the match offers everything that you've told Keeper you're looking for in a partner. It won't waste your time with only good enough matches like other dating apps and matchmaking services will. So, find your Keeper at keeper.ai. That's KEEPER.ai. Is it possible, do you think, to do any of this, to have any degree of self-sufficiency if you're living in the middle of the city? Because we brought like an extra pantry cupboard thing to keep food in, and I have accumulated a whole load of tins of chopped tomatoes and kidney beans, whatever, and my husband pointed out, and he's not wrong, that our street would be on fire long before we got down to the last tin of kidney beans. But it seems to me, and I'm sure to many people, that if you were to if you're going to do this, you have to go live in the middle of nowhere. You have to go live in Uruguay or in, you know, the I mean, I don't even know where you live in the UK where you could have that degree of that amount of land and that degree of self-sufficiency, maybe the Highlands or something. What would you say to people who just can't do that? You know, they can't completely ditch their jobs. They can't run away to the circus, you know. What measures can you take if you live in a city?
So, I think there's a couple of ways of looking at the answer to this question. The first one is you're never ever going to get full self-sufficiency. Almost nobody in the world has ever and is currently totally self-sufficient. Um, so the important thing is, I think, flexing the muscles of thinking about where your food comes from, but not just food. We can get it. Hopefully we'll get into it too. But just even things like skills in the home. Storing things, baking bread, making things from scratch. This like sort of skills of ongoing self provisioning. Things like homeschooling, which is, if for example there's something like a pandemic and everybody's working, doing remote schooling, are you able to step in and think about how you would want your child to be educated? So that's one thing. Another thing is thinking about where your food comes from and who you would need to rely on, or where you want it to come from, I think is really key. And so even for somebody in a city, you could be thinking about who are the closest producers to me. What do they produce? How much of my food can I get from this, from around me seasonally? And there's something really lovely about that process too, because it's a sort of meeting your local farmers, thinking about seasonality and what would a local diet look like. Um, Even something like going on hunting trips or fishing trips, going apple picking and storing it yourself, in the fall. Those are all just sort of little ways to just shift your perspective toward um, not thinking of yourself primarily as a consumer, but instead thinking about yourself as in a web of interdependence with others, and not relying on the most precarious or longest distance functions of the global marketplace to remain intact for you to be able to survive. And it really is just a small shift that can change your way of thinking about things, and it doesn't have to feel like a burden. It should feel fun. It should feel exciting, like a challenge to sort of think about, where do I live? What could I eat that would be local and seasonal? I think a lot of people are thinking more about things like probiotics and raw milk and kombucha and sauerkraut and these kind of things that are sort of more alive foods that in some way you can't necessarily get at the store, because a lot of it is sort of requires tending by human hands. I mean, if you think about it's almost like an alchemy in your kitchen. If you've got a sourdough starter sitting on your counter, and maybe a SCOBY, which is a symbiotic. SCOBY stands for symbiotic colony of bacteria and yeast, and this is how you make a kombucha. It's a fizzy drink that has some sort of good bacteria in it. Very good for gut health. It's just sort of fun, and it's a bit of science and a bit of chemistry. It's good for kids to learn about. But yeah, in general, it's just a sort of shift in mindset toward, thinking about the aspects of your existence. If something broke down in the, industrial civilization, there's some sort of natural disaster, human-made disaster, cultural disaster. I would say even the pandemic, I think, opened up a lot of people's eyes to, we can't just assume business as usual for every aspect of our lives indefinitely. If something happens like this that interrupts our daily schedules, would we be able to adapt? And there's a sort of way in which the skills toward resilience stack. It's like you get into a situation where you're building out resilience and redundancies, and your ability to do that sort of builds on itself in a virtuous cycle toward, more capacity. At first it feels hard, but as you build it, you just end up getting more and more capable and less spooked if anything goes awry, if there's any sort of shock to the supply chain or anything like that. You're ready with your plan and your various redundancies. Let's try this, let's adapt, let's figure it out. And that was really helpful to me during the pandemic with 3 little kids at home. I had a baby at the beginning of the pandemic. I was able to sort of think on my feet and not be stressed and capable, and just thinking, okay, well, there's no school. What are we going to do? How do we approach this? Let's make a plan. Something really empowering about that.
So let's bring it back to sexual politics, because I'm gonna be devil's advocate for a moment. What some feminists would say, what some feminists watching would say, is this all sounds lovely, but I love my disposable nappies. I love my tampons. I love my washing machine. Phyllis Schlafly was right that actually the washing machine liberated women more than feminism ever did. Yeah. Maybe, yes, there will be some future disaster where there is a collapse and we're no longer able to rely on any of these things. But why would I preempt that? Why would I bring this horror on myself and deny myself access to this kind of liberation if I don't have to? I love my washing machine. I wish I had 2, frankly. What's your response to that criticism?
Yeah, I mean, I agree about washing machines, especially. I would not want to be trucking my family's clothes down to the river bank and washing everything by hand with scrub brushes. Absolutely. I mean, some of my work is knowledge work, and that it is made possible by these domestic machines. Just like everything else that I tend to advocate for, nothing needs to be taken to its extreme. There's no reason why anyone needs to take everything to the extreme logical conclusion. of, having some self-sufficiency means you need to be an anarcho-primitivist. You simply don't need to take it to that extreme. There's nothing that requires that logical exercise. So yeah, I think that simultaneously we need to be thinking about the ways in which technology can be liberating, but you're giving something up in return for the use of this technology, and it is in many ways a Faustian bargain. Think, for example, we've never had higher yields of agricultural yields on cropland, but we're just absolutely destroying the environment in the meantime. We're just tilling up the soil. Dust bowls coming. There's just the other day in Illinois, there was a car crash from a giant dust bowl. It's just all tillage agriculture there. You're just pouring chemicals on the land. It just, washes off into the rivers and into all the waterways. There isn't just one indicator that matters, which is yields, and which, a lot of our agricultural yields, they end up rotting away or getting destroyed because we're making too much for need, in some cases, for certain crops. So, the psychotic focus on certain parameters at the expense of others, I call this spreadsheet brain, which is, the way in which we're just sort of motivated by certain measurable parameters that are completely out of balance with the whole of the problem that we might be facing. So, yes, washing machines are good. However, we do not have a dryer. It's so sunny here and such nice weather. We don't need a dryer. And I
Lucky
know,
you.
I mean, yeah, we don't really need one. In the UK, I can imagine there are whole months where you probably couldn't dry your clothes outside. But, it would be very costly, expensive. Electricity is very expensive here. So, there's really no need for it. And in some ways, I think, oh, it would be so easy to just pop these clothes into the dryer. However, there are also sort of unmeasurable ways in which it's sort of nice to go outside and just have a moment to be hanging the clothes on the line and noticing the weather. And there's these little routines that come about when you don't outsource every part of your life to machines and consumption, that really are not measurable. And I couldn't make the case for them in spreadsheet form. But they do exist as real benefits, and they're sort of in some ways spiritual benefits. The capacity, the natural limits. These are fundamentally questions of the sacred and the profane. I mean, this was how we started the conversation, but fundamentally, do we just lean into every convenience and supposed efficiency without any sense of what we're giving up, what we might be violating that is in fact sacred? And I think that's fundamentally where my life is focused, is trying to answer that question.
I just want to ask one last question in this main part of the show, and then we can get into details on marriage and motherhood and more of how this fits with your homesteading project. But how do you do other work? Because I'm sure, again, a lot of people will be listening to thinking, yes, it would be really nice to kind of spend the time on these crafts. I mean, goodness me, since I used to be a really good sewer.
Oh,
I
wow.
sewed my own wedding dress. And then since having a baby and work and everything, I just don't do any of that. And yeah, trying to kind of crowbar modern life into that slower pace of self-sufficiency, it's really, really tough. But you seem to have managed it. What's the strategy that you've arrived
So
at with
yeah,
your
this is
husband?
actually a little bit I discussed this a little bit with Mary Harrington, and she interviewed me for her book, wonderful book, Feminism Against Progress. If you haven't yet gotten it, you should. But she, fundamentally, we think of our marriage and family life as the central project of our lives. And everything else is sort of auxiliary. If I have, if we need work, it's for money. If we have vocational interests, those are secondary. But the major project is our family, our home. And because of that, we made the intentional decision to move to Uruguay to have a sort of period of time where we were primarily parents and only secondarily doing part-time work. But that was only made possible by living very, very frugally. I wrote an article about this for Front Porch Republic called Family Over Fire. Um, FIRE is short for Financial Independence Retire Early. It's like a movement in the US. There's a lot of sort of like finance bros who are into it, but the idea is you save up, you work really hard and earn a lot in your 20s and early 30s so that you can sort of retire early, and focus on other things. We kind of conceptualized retirement as, it is sort of possible to downshift in your work for different periods of time in your life, as opposed to work, as much as you possibly can, lean into your career to the extent possible, and then retire at, 65 or 68, and then, you're kind of tired and all your kids are grown and, they don't really need you like, they needed you when they were babies. So we took about a decade like this, where we're just sort of working part-time remotely. We saved up a bunch before we moved so that we had some buffer, and I say that, but in this period of time, I earned my PhD and we started a school where we hosted students here in Uruguay. So it's not like I wasn't working or accomplishing things, but it was just a sort of different approach toward work and earning and career, where the primary consideration was family and the secondary consideration was making enough to live and, and leaning into career and vocation. Now my three daughters are all school aged, and so I'm leaning further into, my vocational work, my career. I have a full-time postdoc research position. And so, it's possible, I think, to sort of go in career waves. Like I was saying with all my other answers, it doesn't have to be some extreme of one thing or another. Um, I think that it's possible to, it's not really have it all, because I do think that there are totally ways in which working too much can make, especially early parenthood, just miserable. I mean, just horrible for everybody involved, just feeling like you're constantly strained. So taking that period very seriously, like the under 3-year old parent period, very seriously, and thinking, whatever it takes, I'm going to be with my kids. That was primary. And then after that, I think you can just sort of ebb and flow how the family life changes, and my kids, are now starting to do after school programs. So it's like, they launch, they leave the nest, they have their own interests, they have their own life. Um, oh,
Ashley, where can people find more of your work?
Sure. You can find me on Twitter at Rizoma School, Rizoma School. And at Doomer Optimism is my podcast Twitter handle. From there, you should be able to find all the relevant links. Doomeroptimism.com also for wherever you're listen to your podcast, you can find us there.
Ashley, thank you so much. Thank you so much for watching that episode of Maiden, Mother, Matriarch, and for all of your support. It means an enormous amount for the growth of the show. If you want to hear bonus content, an extra 20, 30 minutes of conversation with the guest, maybe a little bit more personal, a little bit less filtered, then you can go to my Substack at Louise louiseperry.substack.com, where you can sign up for extended episodes and also bonus episodes. And you can also access our chat community. You can also support the show by subscribing on YouTube or subscribing wherever you get your podcasts, and rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts is also really great for encouraging other people to give the show a try. Please also spread the word, tell people that you know who you think might like it to give it a shot. The word of mouth effect is really valuable, so we'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, watching, and supporting what we're doing.